So I'm replacing the axle bearings and seals on a 2011 Nissan Xterra Pro-4x. It's got that heavy-duty axle in it. On the regular axles, the seals are pretty easy to replace. They just you pull the axle out, pop the seal out, and then back in, and that's pretty much it. Then you pop your axle back in. This updated axle, I forgot what it is. It's like an M223 or something like that. I'm not sure, but it's the heavy-duty axle for the Pro-4x model. You have to pull the whole axle out, cut the bearings off, and to replace the seal, you have to replace the whole bearing and all that on each axle. This job usually costs around $1,600 to do because they order axles already fitted with new bearings and seals and everything, and they throw them back in the axle for $1,600. Throw them back into the axle casing for $1,600, which the axles themselves with the bearings already pressed on are about $600 a piece, roughly. So let me turn my camera around here. All right, so turn my camera around. This is the axle. Try to get a good look at it. So there's the seal right there, and then that's the bearing, and then you have a retainer nut. This is the retainer. You have to cut them off with the cutoff wheel. I already threw the old bearing away, but they come in a kit. It's about $240 for the kit. You get each retainer, each seal. This is the retainer. Each bearing, retainer, and seal. You can get the new circlips. You don't have to. These work just fine. It's your preference if you want to replace them. But pretty much, you got that version right there, the Pro-4x Xterra. So you take the 4 bolts out, you have to have an axle puller, which I actually built one. Just took an old weight that I had, welded me a piece of like angle iron to a rod, put it on the weight and just pulled it off that way. I don't have to have a fancy brand new tool to do that. Just gotta have some ingenuity. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm gonna show you how to cut and replace these bearings and seals, which I already kind of cut off the old one. I'll show you the race. This is the bearing race right here. I'll show you how to cut that off properly without hurting. You don't want to cut the axle, and you don't want to cut the reluctor wheel for the ABS. If you do, you're gonna have to replace that. And if you cut the axle, your bearing may not have a good press fit. Okay. So how do you get set up here? So I got you. I'm gonna try to get this as best as possible, but it's kind of hard to. I don't know what the focus is gonna do for this part, but you'll see some cutting, grinding. Try not to cut this plate. I can pull the seal off. Let me do that. I might be able to pull the seal off. Just had it in the way so I wouldn't hit the reluctor wheel. It's held on by the retainer itself, or the bearing race itself, but it is possible to pull it off. Just a pain in the ass. Don't pry against the reluctor wheel. You don't want to pry against this. You'll easily break that thing. It's not going to be very easy for me. Here, I don't want to pry against that. Maybe if I do it a little bit. No. There we go. Sorry if I'm in the way. It's kind of a pain in the ass to do this, try to record at the same time. Okay. So there's your seal. I did cut it, which is okay because it's getting replaced. But this angle, this cone, faces toward that way, out that way. So it sits on the axle like that. And you can pull your retainer off. It is okay if you barely nick it. It's not going to hurt nothing. If you barely cut it just a little bit with the grinder or the cutoff wheel, like I kind of did right there, just a little bit, it's not going to hurt nothing. Just don't cut it a lot, because then you'll have an issue. Okay, so what you want to avoid is cutting that reluctor wheel right here. You don't want to cut that at all. Then you'll have to replace that and you'll have an ABS issue. So what I'm going to try to do now, just kind of knock it off. I'll start where you cut. It through enough, it'll easily come loose. It'll eventually break free. May have to cut it again, which I may have to, honestly. Yep, I'm gonna have to cut it a little more to get it free and loose. Do not cut the reluctor wheel. Okay, I had to let my air compressor build up. It's pretty loud and annoying. But if anyone ever has to come across doing this, anyone that watches this video, which probably won't be many, I'm not responsible for your fuck ups, just to let you know. This is just a video to kind of show you and give you an idea of how to do it if you have to do it yourself. When you're using a cutoff wheel, use a small one. They have bigger ones, but they have smaller ones too, which the smaller one is best for this job because you can cut through all the way through the bearing race without getting close to your reluctor wheel. But this is just to give you an idea, and more content for my YouTube. more. There it is. Like that. See, I didn't actually cut all the way through. It just kind of relieves the pressure, and it might actually break, which that did break and crack all the way through. So if you just hit it right where your cut mark is, you have a possibility of cracking it and breaking all the way through. So you don't actually have to cut all the way through. You just clean it up, make sure it's nice and clean before you put the new stuff on. All right, got it all cleaned up. Just, clean up as best you can. Clean up your work area, get all the metal shavings and everything away from the new bearings and seals. You don't want it in there. So the new seals, they'll come with the grease already lined inside of it. This grease helps break in the new seal on the axle. So this goes that way. This goes on first. Then your seal. Try not to touch the seal on the axle as you're putting it on, so you don't want to wipe that grease off. Just work it on there. I mean, some's gonna come off as you put it on, but it's okay. You can use it, wipe it around the axle for when you install your bearing. The grease will help. New bearing. There's like this little lip right here. This lip points that way. There's this ring is separate from the outer race on the bearing. It does come apart, no need to, because it just all slides into the axle pretty easily. You know, the bearing spins on the inner presses onto the axle. When you press bearings on, say the axle is going in here, and you're pressing on the axle from this direction down. You're gonna put a spacer in between this and your press. Don't press on the outer race, you wanna press on the inner race. If you press on the outer race, you're gonna damage the bearing itself. You're gonna press on the inner race when you're pressing it all together this way. Just like that. Then you got your retaining ring. This presses on after the bearing. You can use that to help press the bearing on itself. So you're literally you're gonna have this sitting on the press, and it's going to press on the inner race of the bearing while you're pressing. The press itself, the hydraulic part, is going to be pressing down here, pushing downward. Unless you have a different type of press setup. All right, now I'm set up on my press. I gotta use some type of spacer up here because I can't press directly on the axle with the press head itself. It won't work out that way. So I gotta put something here to press on. Make sure it's center. You want it center in your press so you don't have any issue. I'll try to show you. There's a little press head up there right here. It's gonna press down on this, pressing the axle into the bearing. Make sure before you press it, make sure all your stuff is on correctly, because if it's not, you're gonna have to cut it all back off and buy a whole new set of bearings and bearings and seals, and redo all that shit all over again. Don't want to do that. The bearing presses on fairly easy. The retaining ring is a little bit harder. So that's the bearing. Let me set up my retaining ring on it. Okay. The ring doesn't have a specific way it goes on. Just put it on there and you got to press it together. It's very tight. Make sure you have a good press. Now it's going to try to go a little sideways. It's going to try to catty corner off a little bit, so you have to kind of correct it as you're pressing on at first. Just make sure it presses on correctly, all the way flush to the bearing. You don't want a gap in between that and the bearing. You want it completely tight. So you gotta have a good press to do this. It's kind of going off center a little bit now. I just want to get it pressed in a little bit, then I'll loosen it up and fix it. I'll change exactly where it presses on the axle. So go back a little bit, come forward with the press. So it presses in a different area, and I'll press it down a little bit center, a little bit more center than it was. Okay, went off a little bit more, fix that. Bring it forward and then go side to the side with it. Keep a little room in between your plates and your axle. You don't want to scratch it. I guess it won't hurt if it scratches. You just don't want to gouge it. Okay. Loosen up and recenter. It's very tight. Bring it this way just a little bit more. So it's pressed all the way tight on that side, all the way around. I'm going to scoot it over now and do the other side. Just to make sure it's completely seated. That's it. Just checking with my light to make sure. Looks good. All right, so you gotta pull the old bearing, outer bearing race. Oh, hold on, my phone's dying here. Take the glove off. Okay, so you gotta pull the old bearing, the outer bearing race out of the axle. Which is pretty simple. It's not pressed in, it's just kind of slid in there. Could be kind of tight. So what I do, get my little slide hammer and just pull it right on out. And then on the axle itself, bearing, the outer bearing race is already on the bearing. So you just slide the axle in. But first, clean up your whole area, clean up where the seal slides in and everything. Just be careful putting it in. Make sure that seal is lined correctly inside this hole, so you don't kink or you don't pinch it. Nothing. You don't want to damage that seal because you're gonna have to do this whole job over again if you do that. So just clean this up real nice and clean. Put the axle in, center it up. Make sure your bolts are going to be in the holes first as you press on, and then just carefully push it in. It's not going to go all the way in. You got to tighten these down so you can make it seal, to get the bearing and seal all the way in the axle. So just easily do it, clean it up, easily do it, and you're good to go. This axle is pretty oily, so if yours is this bad, make sure you clean up your parking brake shoes and your shroud, the dust shroud and everything. Clean them up really good, get some good degreaser. Just clean it up, spray it down with water, and wipe it down, blow it off with an air gun, whatever you gotta do. Just make sure these shoes are clean. And also your rotor, clean up your rotor pretty good too. So that's pretty much it. After that, I mean, you can throw it back together and all that. Also, clean up your caliper and your brake pads if they're this bad, so you don't have burning, you don't smell like burning gear oil, because that shit stinks. I hate the smell of gear oil in the first place. But yeah, other than that, throw it back together and you're good to go. So thanks for watching. Oh yeah, another thing, torque these down to 50 foot-pounds. these nuts that go in here on the back of your brake rotor and everything, all that shit. Torque these down to 50 foot-pounds. And for me, I usually torque down my caliper bracket bolts, the big ones that go in here. They bolt to here. I usually torque those down to about 60 to 80 foot-pounds roughly. I usually do about 80 just to be safe, because when you're changing brakes, you usually don't take off your caliper bracket. You just take off the caliper itself to change your pads. So I torque those down to around 80 foot-pounds. So, yep, that's pretty much it.